Hi, welcome back to Be Real Talks. I am your host, Sophia Gibri. Today I have with us Christine Cruzvergara. She has held several leadership roles in academia and career services. She is known to be a creative problem solver, organizational change agent, and embracer of transformation. Christine is intentional when rethinking the best practices for serving students and building a team. What I most admire about Christine is that she is a fierce advocate for equity and access and truly believes that where you come from doesn't have to define where you go. Currently, Christine is the VP of Higher Education and Student Success at Handshake. And today we're going to be talking about leadership and standing out in a virtual space. So thank you so much, Christine, for joining us today. I am going to jump right in because if I had it my way, I would ask you a million questions. My first question for you is, how has your identity influenced your passion and drive?
Such a good question, Sophia. Thank you so much for having me on today. I would say, my identity has often served as a motivator to being able to not only achieve the goals that I've set out for myself, but hopefully to make the world and our society, our community, a better place for those that face some of the same barriers. I admit that as a person, there's probably nothing more motivating than someone telling me I can't do it or they don't see how that would be possible. It really kind of lights a fire under me in wanting to prove them wrong, quite frankly, and wanting to try and find a way to make it happen, to make it possible. I fully recognize that often it will be hard. There will absolutely be sometimes unsurmountable barriers to that. And I like to look at that as a challenge to figuring out, okay, well then how do we get around that? How do we create a new reality of what that could look like? Whether it's a barrier to me being a woman or being young in some of the leadership roles I've had, or as an Asian American. And the reality is we also have this intersectionality of all of our identities that come together, which for me, my early part of my career was in higher education, where I was not only a woman of color, I was a young woman of color in positions where I often sat at tables with people 20, 25 years my senior. And that in and of itself carries a lot of difficulty. So I would say my identity has been a very motivating factor for me.
Yeah, I think that's great. And that really resonates with me personally. When you pose an idea or you meet those challenges and that really pushing you even further. And I think that some of the students listening will probably be able to relate to that a lot and understand that oftentimes aspects of our identity that may seem like setbacks or obstacles are actually what really, really shapes our strengths, right? And that shapes our resiliencies. And it doesn't matter what age we are, we earn those seats at those tables. And it's so, so important. Kind of building on that, what is one of the biggest challenges that you faced as a woman in leadership?
As a woman in leadership, I think one of the biggest challenges I faced is that my approach and the way in which I lead might look different than what other people think when they're thinking leadership. And that, of course, has ebbed and flowed depending on the institution I was at, the type of position I was at, the type of leadership team I happen to be on. But I take a personally very collaborative, inclusive, communicative, transparent approach to my leadership. It's just naturally sort of who I am and how I show up most authentically. And that sometimes can look very different in rooms or settings where the majority of the people might be purely very analytical or data-driven or logical, if you will, by those terms. And the reason I'm sort of hesitant as I even say those is it's not that I'm not those things. I am also data-driven. I am logical. I am analytical. However, it shows up in a different way. And it often shows up in the way that I might examine interpersonal relationships. It might show up in me recognizing that the data is one piece of the pie, but you also have this qualitative piece, which technically is also data, but is not always treated as so, right? That also plays into it. You have perception, whether that's your students or your customers or your partners. And while it's not always logical, people are not always logical. And so those aspects filter into how you do work and how you do business and how you make decisions and how you communicate. And so for me, the emotion and the people dynamic is not divorced from the work that we do. It is so much a part of the work that we do. And I think in the moments where I have been one of the few women or the only woman at the table, I think sometimes those aspects can come across as soft or as touchy-feely rather than carry the same weight and credibility that somebody with a graph or a chart might have. And so I think those are some of the moments that I've noticed the most. And then I would say in the early part of my career, especially because I was at tables with people that were often so much older than me, my age was an identity that was also incredibly salient. I recognize that I don't look my age necessarily all the time. And so I often got mistaken for a student, or I got mistaken for someone I was not, or for someone more junior. And so I always recognized that the first thing out of my mouth in a meeting with people who did not know me had to be sharp, had to be on point, right? I had a very small, I had a much smaller margin of error than other people. And so that pressure is present in my life, and I have to acknowledge that, and I have to be able to channel that.
Yeah, I think there's two great things to really unpack there is finding your own leadership style, regardless of how it's interpreted by your identity, right? So even though you are a woman and you have that communicative, transparent leadership style, you kind of just went for it, right? You're like, this is what works for me, and used your own voice through it. And then I really like the aspect of what you said about the ageism, right? And looking younger in certain spaces and how I relate to that 100%, right? I'm often confused as a student. I'll be at a meeting where there's no way a student would have been invited to the meeting, right? Or found a location. And there's this idea of I have that same pressure of really just, okay, the first thing I say has to be the most articulate. And I think that is a challenge that students should, they're definitely facing in student leadership positions and should definitely be aware of that going forward in the workplace. That is still something that continues to face, causes us to face some challenges.
Absolutely.
So in building on leadership, I really think that no matter what position you're in, you can demonstrate strong leadership. So even if it is, an entry-level position, right, things along those lines. So looking at our students, do you have advice for students who are in internships or entry-level positions? They really, really want to advocate for themselves or others, but they're a little nervous about it because it's risky.
Yeah, Sophia, I love what you just said. I 100% believe that leadership is an action, not a title. I think that's really important to remember here. So I'll just say that again. Leadership is an action, not a title. So what you just said is 100% true. It doesn't matter what position you happen to be in, what role you play, how sort of low in the hierarchy it might seem that you are. The reality is your actions and how you carry yourself every day is part of your leadership. It's part of who you are and how you show up in the world. So for students who are starting off, you might be an intern or you might be in an entry-level role. I think there are a couple different facets that I would encourage you to think about. First is take the time to really learn, right? Part of being a leader, it doesn't matter how senior you are. Great CEOs, great presidents, great VPs, great directors are the ones that are always learning. And they're the ones that have an open enough mind and perspective to recognize that you actually don't know everything, right? And I think that's actually such a hallmark of the great leaders that I have had the pleasure of working with, is the more you actually learn, the more you realize how little you know and how much more you actually have to learn. So I think as a student, you can already start that process is be open to learning, ask a ton of questions, right? That's number two, ask a ton of questions. There's nothing more important than being curious and trying to figure out how do the pieces connect, right? Everything in our world is so truly interconnected and interrelated, but we often don't talk about it that way. We talk about them in silos. And even when you go into the companies that you might be interning or working at, you often are going to be part of a particular division or a particular team. That team is part of a larger whole. So ask questions that help you to understand, how does the work I do actually lead to the larger mission or goal of this particular company? How do the decisions I make or my team makes impact these other teams that are next to me that seem tangential to the work that I do, right? That type of knowledge is going to be really helpful for you because it allows you to be a better leader in navigating what could be great ideas, great suggestions. And then the third part I would add to all of this is really pay attention to the people dynamics. This is often left out, especially when you're a new employee or an entry-level worker, because you're so focused on the tasks that you have at hand. But you also have to focus on the people that help get things done. So pay attention in your organization. Who makes the decisions? How do decision-making sort of patterns flow through your organization? So when something needs to happen, who are the people that tend to be consulted? What does that process look like? Does it happen in formal meetings? Does it actually happen mostly outside of the meeting? Does it happen by the water cooler? Whose perspective is often weighed more heavily than others? Sometimes you're going to find that that's associated to title. Sometimes you're going to find that it actually is associated to tenure and how long someone has been there. Sometimes you'll find that it's associated to who you know, right? And these are all really important inputs, because if you are trying to be a leader and you are trying to help affect positive change, you have to be able to navigate this environment. For better or worse, fair or not, you have to be able to know how to navigate that environment. So those are three of the things that I would highly encourage you as a student. Doesn't matter what role you're in, you can do that.
Yeah, and I think that highlighting critical thinking is often one of those competencies and skills that is kind of pushed back a lot of the time, right? And it's so important, as you describe in the workplace, to really assess what's going on, figure out who they're looking to for bigger decisions, right? And being able to use all of that intake in a way where you're more informed and you could be more effective in those kinds of decisions. But kind of thinking about that, after the students have really assessed their workplace, thought critically about, the workplace dynamics, have you personally ever, can you think of a time where you advocated for yourself or others and you were nervous about it going into it?
Oh my gosh, Sophia, I have so many stories I could tell you. Yes, I've been nervous many, many times. I mean, the reality is, anytime you're going to advocate for yourself or for your team, there's a possibility that you'll fail, right? There's a possibility that you won't get the thing that you were trying to advocate for. And the reality is that is actually more common than getting the thing that you're looking for, but it can't hold you back from trying. I think also a big piece of negotiation is to do it authentically and to recognize that in a negotiation, it's a process. It's not a one or done sort of thing. I advocated for this. I didn't get it from me and Sophia, so now it's over, right? It's like, okay, well, I didn't get it this time, so let me try a different angle. Or let me see, okay, I couldn't get us from 0 to 60. Could I get us from 0 to 30? Could I get us from 0 to 10, right? Like, any progress is better than no progress. So you can't let the sort of defeat keep you from trying, and you also can't let it keep you from continuing to make progress towards whatever it is you're trying to do. I'll give you one very personal example of a time when I advocated for myself where I was super, super nervous, and it turned out to work out great. So I was negotiating for a particular job that I was going out for. I'd gotten the offer. It was a very senior level position, and I knew I needed to negotiate. And I knew through my research that the role in which they were asking me to take on was very large, huge in scope, reporting to the president of the institution, and compared to my two male counterparts at other institutions that had very similar roles, they were making significantly more than what this role had sort of like offered initially. And so as I went back for that negotiation, I negotiated $50,000 more. Like, that's a huge amount of money. That is, for some people, their entire salary for the year, right? Okay, so I was extremely nervous about going into that particular conversation because I recognized the scale at which I was about to talk to them about my compensation and what that meant. But I felt confident in that this is a conversation. It was the first and only job that I have negotiated where I truly felt like it was a conversation. I had negotiated in other positions where I felt like it was a negotiation, and it was like me versus them. And it wasn't until this position that I started to recognize a negotiation is truly no more than a conversation. It's a conversation between two people that would ideally like to have terms that allow them both to be successful, right? That's really all it is. And so they want me to be successful in this role because it will help them, their institution, their students. I want to be successful in this role. And so there's just a few things that I need in order for that to happen. And so I had negotiated my title, my salary, the team that I essentially was a part of so that I could be part of academic council, have voting rights, XYZ, all of those things. but it's to think about it in totality. And in having that conversation, I realized that I didn't need to be as nervous as I initially went into it sort of feeling, because they responded in kind, recognizing, well, look, we want you to be successful too. We realize that this is a really big change, this is a really big shift, and we also want to do what we can in order to sort of accommodate for that. And so we ended up having a really great conversation. And at the very end, the thing that was said to me is one that I will always remember, which is, I feel so confident, this happened to be a career education position, I feel so confident in our students' ability to learn how to advocate and take care of themselves if this is the kind of negotiation you're going to be able to teach them, right? And it was such a wonderful, validating, affirming moment in that the position I was going for, I mean, it almost would have looked silly if I hadn't. It would have looked silly if I had not done that. And so I'm glad that I did, because it also was a show of strength in terms of what I would be able to impart on the students.
Yeah, I think that's so powerful, right? What they said to you, that response, and really shows how they valued you. And I think it's really worth re-emphasizing that it's not one-sided. These are conversations. So
Yeah.
think of them as conversations going forward, and then it becomes less nerve-wracking for sure.
Definitely.
So whether it be, internships, interviews, or jobs, how can students from historically underrepresented communities really stand out in these virtual spaces now that a lot of things have gone virtual?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. So let me talk about the bigger question of how they stand out, but then let me also talk about it in terms of a virtual setting, because there's like little overlap on all of that. So first, I think a student from an underrepresented background, I myself certainly fall into a lot of those categories and did as a student, both as a student of color, a woman, daughter of two immigrants, first generation student, right? A lot of those labels sort of applied to me personally. I would highly encourage you to think about what makes you unique. What makes you different? How did the hardships that you've had to face, the obstacles and the challenges that you've had over the course of your life, whether it's recent or your entire life, how has that actually shaped you into who you are? Being reflective about that is actually going to be really important, because as you answer the different questions that you're going to get in an interview, or as you show up as a candidate, what they really are looking for often is your authentic self. They want to know, who are they working with? Who are you? Is really kind of the question that they're trying to get at. My guess is that as a Binghamton student, you have all the skills. You've gotten a great education. They have taught you well. You have a lot of the hard skills. It is the who are you piece that is going to help you stand out and give you kind of like, it's almost like the nice wrapping to your gift, right? It is the package that you put it all in. So think about, what are those challenges? How have they shaped who you are? More importantly, what have you learned from them? And how will you apply that learning to the work that you do, right? Has having the number of challenges you've had made you grittier? Is it added to your determination or your persistence? Does it help you actually see multiple possibilities and solutions when you look at a problem? Or maybe because of the fact that you had to help translate for your parents growing up, it allows you to really understand people who don't communicate like you, and to be able to see their perspective in a new way, right? Like, there are ways that you can talk about and think about those particular challenges as assets, not liabilities for you. And when you layer in the virtual component, the reason I said this is slightly separate is I fully recognize that for some of our students, you might be challenged, like I am, with really bad internet. And you might have a really horrible connection. You might live in a home where you're sharing it with much of your family members and you don't have a quiet space. Or your home doesn't look nice and you can't have it in the background, right? So thinking about all of those components, I would encourage you to do a little sort of planning beforehand if you're going to be on a call or you're going to be on an interview. Make sure you have a good virtual background that you feel comfortable with, that's going to make you feel like you're showcasing and showing off your personality and your best self. Make sure you can find a quiet spot, even for a moment, even if that means you might have to leave your home and go somewhere else. Make sure you think about things like, do I need to invest in possibly a hotspot on my phone, or to be able to do something along those lines so that I have at least good internet for like that call or that moment, right? And what does that need to look like? Could I borrow it from a friend or from somebody else perhaps, right? And so kind of think through those components. I recognize that they're not easy. You should also ask your institution if they might have any funding or help. I know I was talking with some colleagues at Villanova, and they've been as an institution thinking about, is there a way for us to try and provide internet or hotspots or things like that, particularly for students that might not have access to those things? So as a student, ask. The worst answer is, no, we don't have anything or we don't have funding, but you won't know if you don't at least ask the question.
Yeah, for sure. I, first of all, love that you mentioned just showing up, figuring out your brand, being authentic. That's really a big part of the Be Real series. But kind of a more practical question related to the virtual interviews or job responsibilities. Some students might say they have secured a different location for an interview or for something that needs work that needs to get done for their job. Is it okay for the student to kind of communicate to their employer that they need to change the date of the interview, or they need to be a little bit more flexible with deadlines for their responsibilities?
Yeah, I think it is fine for a student to have that honest conversation with the HR representative or the hiring manager, whoever you happen to be in communication with for that particular job. However, I would actually encourage you to be upfront and to be honest about why it is that you might need a shift or a change. You don't want to come across as flighty. You don't want to come across as, oh, you forgot and you didn't prepare and now you're asking for an extension. You don't want to come across as you don't care about their time, right? I know that as students, you also recognize it's a lot of time and it's really hard work for them to also have to go through so many candidates and go through this process. So have empathy for the other side as well, and make sure that how you communicate with them is according to how you would want to be communicated if you happen to be the employer and you were interviewing folks and now you have a candidate coming to you asking for a change of some reason. You probably would want to know, but why? Like, what's happened that might cause you to need that? And I think the more authentic and heartfelt that can be, you don't have to go into a million details about said situation, but I think allowing them to understand, look, these are some of the challenges that I face currently. I'm helping to take care of my young siblings because my parents happen to be working in positions where they cannot work from home, or they're essential workers, or they have to be in and they don't have days off or sick leave. And my little brother or sister has just gotten sick and I have to take them to the doctors, or I need to take care of them. And I know that I will not be able to be on this call uninterrupted, during that time. I also want to show up for you the very best that I can, because this position is very important to me. Is there any way that we might be able to adjust or make this flexible, X, Y, and Z? These are people. They're going to be understanding. They're also going to be empathetic. And quite frankly, if they're not, you have to ask yourself the question of whether or not you want to work for a company that wouldn't be, right? So I think it ultimately, you have a lot more power and influence than you might feel you have. But I would encourage you, it does require some level of courage and vulnerability as well.
Yeah, and I can really attest to that proactive approach, as having experience as an instructor and working with students. There's a big difference when a student reaches out to you and tells you why they need an extension, or asks why they need an extension, and providing that extra information, versus the student who kind of after the fact comes in with very little details. It really does make that difference to have that clear, effective communication, for sure. So my last question for you is, so you released an email from your Handshake account that unequivocally supported Black Lives Matter. I have read a lot of these emails, and I really thought this one stood out to me, right? You address systemic racism, use the wording, you emphasize tangible goals that will be taking place. So can you talk to us a little bit more about the changes that Handshake's really incorporated to address equal representation and equity?
Yeah, so we have 4 major work streams that have sort of kicked off within our organization, some of which have actually only been just sort of built upon things that we were already doing. We just formalized it a little bit more. The first work stream is us as individuals. your organization is truly only as good as the individuals that make up that organization, right? The organization is its people. And in order for us to really think about racial equity, for us to think about how we support our Black community, our Black students, our Black colleagues and partners, we have to do a lot of self-examination and internal work around figuring out who are we, what do we understand, what is our education and exposure to all of this, what is our deep knowledge of the history and context that has gotten us here, and what are the biases that we individually carry? How have we perpetuated some of the systems of oppression and racism that we were born into, that we live within, that we work within, and what does that mean in terms of how we show up, and how do we truly internalize it? Because if we don't, we're going to keep making the same decisions that are going to end up showing up in the same systems and structures that we are all talking about trying to make better right now. So that's the first work stream. The second work stream is really focused on what you just talked about, which is Handshake as a company in terms of our representation. So right now, we have a very diverse team in terms of people of color, but when it comes to our Black representation within the person of color, within the people of color, it's actually, I believe it's about 6% or so. That's not representative of the Black community overall when you look at the US. We definitely have improvement and progress that we need to make. I believe it might be, I think maybe it's closer to 13 or 14% nationally in terms of Black representation. And so we definitely have more work to do in terms of hiring and how we think about filling positions at every level. So from entry level to manager to director to VP, the exec team, we don't have that representation yet, and we need to actually figure that out. So that is actually what that particular group is working on in trying to draw out a plan for both how do we think about attracting candidates to some of those roles? How do we ensure that we are creating a culture within our organization that is actually inclusive, that is open to hearing from and having these voices at the table? And then we also need to look at it from a promotion standpoint. So for the Black employees that we do have, how do we ensure that they are not getting left behind when we talk about promotions and advancement? And then we also need to look at it from a board level. So those are all of the various ways in which we are starting to put those plans in place. First was really just an analysis of where we are. And what does that actually look like? And are there disparities when it comes to compensation, for example? We actually looked at it not just from across Black employees and white employees, but across people of color and our white employees. We looked at it from a gender perspective, men versus women. So those are all the various cuts of data that we're analyzing at the moment. We don't have all of the data just yet, so we're in the process of analyzing. And then from there, we can start to develop a plan for what that will look like and how that will get better. We are also in the conversation of potentially hiring a DEI consultant that will help us with some of the very specific strategies and techniques around our internal work in that way. And then I would say the last two work streams that we're also doing are around our product and then around our partnership. So our product piece is one of the things that we believe in is that DEI work is not a separate from our work stream. It should be embedded and integrated into everything that we're doing. And product is obviously the main thing that Handshake produces. So as part of our product process, as part of our PRDs, which is a document that you use when you're in product to help define whatever it is you're building, we need to build into those processes an awareness and also kind of checks and balances for us around diversity and equity questions. And so we have a group that's tasked with literally looking at all of that and looking at the processes across our organization and how we all work together and how those pieces can truly be embedded and integrated. And then the last work stream is around our partnerships in the larger ecosystem. So we're very fortunate to partner with over 1,000 universities. We're fortunate to have, I think, over 450,000 employers, 17 million students and alumni. That's a really powerful network. So how do we actually help to catalyze the conversation across all of these various partners? How do we use the influence that we might have in the corporate world or in industry alongside our investors to help channel some of that energy, channel resources, and channel knowledge or connections that could be really helpful for our Black students, for HBCUs, so on and so forth.
Yeah, and kind of an aside, we do spend time talking on this show of how to really assess if an employer values equity and inclusion and equal representation.
Yeah.
And I will say, if they can't answer questions the way Christine did, then that should be kind of a flag there that it's not a high priority. But as a career consultant, I work with students who come in and they go, what is this handshake thing? How do I use it? So on the student facing side of it, how can Black students in particular really use Handshake effectively to the most effective way possible?
Absolutely. Well, first get on it. Make sure that you claim your account, you log on, you activate. The second thing I would say is make sure you fill out your profile. So a student who completes their profile, particularly making sure that you put in your geographic preferences, your job role preferences, and the job type, like internship, full-time job, so on and so forth. Those three components in particular, when you complete, you are 80% more likely to get a message from an employer. 80%. That is huge. So as a student, please make sure you go and do that. Our employers are always looking to diversify. They're always looking to do better in that way. Now, as Sophia said, not all employers, just because they're looking for it, mean that they will have an inclusive environment. And you as a student, especially as a Black student, you're going to have to ask some critical questions to sort of see what environment am I potentially walking into. Now, I know that we have students kind of across the spectrum. Some of you are thinking, I only want to go into organizations that already kind of have it together, right? Nobody's perfect, but I want to go into one that is already fairly ahead of the game. They have a pretty inclusive environment. They are pretty attuned to the issues that we all face, and they are working diligently on kind of moving that forward. Great. You might have some that are like, you know what, I'm okay if I'm in an environment where that may not be the case. I can maybe help move that along, and you're going to help change from the inside. Also totally cool. And you might have some that actually actively want to go into spaces where you know that it's actually not super inviting because there's so much potential for the change that needs to happen there. And you believe that you will be an amazing advocate and activist from inside that organization to really help them see new ways of looking at things and to help shift perhaps the culture of that whole industry or that type of company. And that's okay too. And so I think for you personally, you also have to decide, where are you at the moment in this process? And what does that look like? And what do you feel ready to take on? And that is going to help you as you use Handshake to start looking for these different types of opportunities. So log on, fill out your profile, and then start searching for the different jobs that look interesting to you. Save them so that you can start to really analyze, what are the skills, what are the patterns, what are the trends that I keep seeing as pretty common. That's going to help you prepare for your interview. It'll help you prepare for your resume, your cover letter, your application. It can help you in your conversation with the Career Center when you come in to chat with your advisor around that. You also want to utilize two other components of the system. The one is Q&A and reviews. This is a chance to actually put your questions out there to other Handshake students or to read reviews that other Handshake students have had for some of the organizations or companies you want to work at. It'll give you some insight that you can't always garner from the website because these are real people's experiences. So read that. The second component is peer messaging. You can actually then message a student that has written something that you found intriguing or helpful or useful and follow up with them to get even more detail or more information about the interview process or about, hey, you mentioned that you wish this had been a little bit different. Can you talk to me a little bit more about that, right? These are the extra elements that Handshake can actually help you that I think most people actually don't utilize. Always in Handshake, they go straight to the job board. You want to go straight to the job board too, but you also want to tack on these extra components because that networking and building that community is going to be so helpful for you.
I like how you brought it. That's definitely the case, right? As students will log on and look for jobs on Handshake. So I like how you really brought out how it is a community and it's another networking tool, especially with COVID and being a lot of people being inside. So it's not just LinkedIn, there's Handshake too, where you can really kind of connect with peers who have those like-minded goals.
Exactly.
All right. Well, thank you so much again for joining us, Christine. I know that I'm always inspired by her leadership, and I hope that students watching can really take some gems, take some tidbits from this interview, and be just as inspired as well. So thanks to all the students watching, and I will see you on the next one.